أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Our emotional level, our emotional control, and by mental health struggles that may be exhibited, whether it is anxiety or depression or even struggling with a sense of despair. Now, as we kind of journey through the internal and start moving towards the external, we also have to look at environmental factors. What exacerbates the mental health struggles that you may be experiencing? When you are experiencing depression, for example, and you look around at your family members, do you feel like you have support from among the family that surrounds you? Do you feel that family may be causing some of the difficulties that you're experiencing? Maybe it has to do with the words that are said. Maybe you live in a household in which there is domestic violence or some form of domestic abuse. Maybe you live in a household where there is intense sibling rivalry that you struggle with. Maybe there are aspects of stress. Maybe there's stress from the dunya in which you are struggling to achieve something and you feel like you just can't achieve it no matter what you do. Maybe there's financial burdens that you're struggling with. Each of these external elements are elements that we can't ignore, that we have to try to tackle and say, what can I do to try to work through this environmental difficulty? Now, there's two different approaches that we often see individuals taking when it comes to dealing with the external environmental factors. There is an empathy-oriented approach and there is an action-oriented approach. So if you see someone struggling, and maybe that someone is, taking, the person's in college and they're taking 21 credits and they feel overwhelmed and it's a lot. In taking an action-oriented approach, you might advise that person and say, just drop a class. What's the big deal, right? Maybe they're living in circumstances at home that are causing a lot of tension. You might tell them from an action-oriented approach, just leave. Why do you have to stay home? Go, move out, right? And that action-oriented approach, even though it's well-meaning, it may not be realistic. It may not be a path that that person can journey on. And so it's important when someone is struggling in that place of darkness, or if you yourself are struggling through it, finding the empathy orientation, learning how to listen. We often say that we've been created with one mouth and two ears so that we could listen more and talk less. But so many times, in a well-meaning way, we tend to talk more and listen less. And that listening is so important because it's how we show that we really understand. Active listening is a bit different than passive listening. So when someone tells you, I'm struggling, I'm really going through a lot right now. Things at home are very stressful. My parents are doing X, Y, Z. My spouse is doing this. I'm experiencing that. It's really a lot for me. Your first course of action is not to suggest action. So your first course of action is not to suggest action. The first course of action is to provide empathy, to listen, to hear the person out, to really understand, and to do it with active listening, where you might ask questions and say, well, what is it that your parents said that really hurt you? What is it that your spouse said? Why don't we think about where that's coming from? Don't provide an action, don't provide a solution, because often in those places of darkness, what the individual is looking for is an emotional connection. And what better example of emotional connection do we have than in the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? There's a beautiful narration of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam sitting at the table with Aisha radiallahu anha, where Aisha says, in narrating the hadith, that she was on her menses during that time. And she said she took a glass of water and took a sip of it and placed the glass back on the table. And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam took that glass, turned it to the exact spot that the lips of Aisha radiallahu anha had touched, and he drank from that spot. Now, how does this exhibit to us empathetic listening, emotional connection, and high emotional intelligence? In this example, we see that Aisha radiallahu anha mentions that she was on her menses because she probably wasn't feeling 100% well. Maybe she was feeling a little unclean. The Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, anticipating that emotion, knew how to respond to it without even saying any words, simply by an action, by sitting beside her and drinking from the glass from where her lips had touched. Imagine if we can incorporate that type of empathetic orientation in our interactions. I'm sure the world would be a much, much better place. So continue to watch iTVusa every day in Ramadan for more of these episodes where we explore our emotional wellness, our mental health, and our social and relational well-being. Jazakumullahu khair. Wassalamu alaikum.